This is Rudy Giuliani back with Rudy's Common Sense. Today's episode is with a man who has deep knowledge and tremendous experience with the regime of terror. And by the regime of terror, I mean the Ayatollah's regime in Iran. I do not consider it a government. I do not consider it anything else but a insanely religiously inspired monarchy, dictatorship, oppressive government. So I call it the regime of terror because they've killed so many of their own people, as well as others. There are very few people that know as much about it as Alireza Jafarzadeh. And Alireza, I think, can describe the new president and what we have in store for us with this new president, which I think most of us know very little about, as we do about a lot of things in Iran. And Alireza can open our eyes to what's going on there. So it's a great pleasure for me to have a true patriot of his country, Alireza Jafarzadeh. Alireza, how are you?
Thank you so much, Mayor. Really a great pleasure to be on your show, and very happy to be with you at this show today.
So we should tell people so they understand that you and I have worked together now over a dozen years on the effort of Iranian dissidents, Iranian refugees, the people who have been murdered and tortured by the regime of terror, and trying very hard, first of all, to keep them alive, and then, as much as possible, to see a restoration of freedom and liberty in Iran. So we've been colleagues now, I think it's for over a decade. So people should understand that I do have a perspective on this. But you're going to tell them facts that they can look up in history books. And it's just unfortunate that Americans don't know enough about this. So just tell us your background. Of course, you originally were born in Iran, and probably when the Shah was in power, correct?
Absolutely, yes, Mayor. I was born in the city of Mashhad in Iran, which is the second most populated city in Iran. And I eventually graduated from high school in Mashhad, went to Tehran, went to a very high level, the highest level technical university in Tehran, Sharif University of Technology. And then I transferred to the United States in 1975. That was at the time of the Shah, to complete my studies, first at the University of Michigan, that's where I got my bachelor's degree, and then at the University of Texas in Austin, where I got my master's degree there.
And by then... And that was in engineering, correct? Civil engineering.
Yes, civil engineering, exactly, yes. And by then, Mayor, by the time I finished and I was ready to go back and help rebuild in the country, by then the Ayatollahs had started a reign of terror in the country. That was 1981. And just about all the friends that I had from high school years to college years in Iran, they had either disappeared, arrested, or already killed. And that's how I got further involved in trying to, as you said, save lives and shed light on the realities of Iran. I emphasize a lot on working on human rights issues, dealing with the United Nations and other organizations in New York and other places. Then came to Washington, trying to.
When did you first come to Washington?
It was actually 1984 that I came to Washington, 84, 85. And I started basically working with trying to provide information to members of Congress to generate support and for them to understand what's really happening in Iran. And then I was involved in exposing the nuclear sites of Iran in August of 2002. That's when we were able to reveal the nuclear sites in Natanz and Iraq.
Oh, sure. That was a very, very big
first time.
That was a very big development. And that earned you a fatwa, I believe.
Well, the fatwa of the Khomeini, who was the supreme leader before Supreme Leader Khamenei. The fatwa of Khomeini was issued in 1988 against all of the political prisoners in Iran who remained loyal to the main political movement in Iran known as the Mujahideen Khalq, or the MEK. This is the movement that wants to bring freedom and democracy in Iran. They are been very vehemently against the Islamic extremism, Islamic fundamentalism of the Iranian regime. And Khomeini saw them as a big threat to the existence of the regime. So he issued a fatwa in '88 based on that.
Let me just stop you for a moment, because this becomes very important when we describe the history of Ibrahim Raisi, who has just been elected president, about whom I think the people in the West know very little about. He hasn't been one of the major figures that's been projected, but is a man of great concern. So that 1988 massacre is a very, very dark moment, even in the terrible history of the Reign of Terror, isn't it? It's one of their worst incidents, where they slaughtered, we don't even know how many people, right? I mean, and basically it was focused on the people in prison, and it was focused on the Mujahideen al-Khalq, but they also killed other political dissidents for other reasons. I mean, that was the main focus, but there were a lot of other people killed.
Absolutely, Mayor. The fatwa was issued against the MEK, and it was very explicit. The fatwa of Khomeini said that because this movement wants to undermine the state, meaning wants to bring democracy in Iran, anyone who is loyal to them needs to be executed. He said that they are categorized as waging war against God, muharib, which is the sentence would be death. And then he appointed what they call a death commission, consisted of 4 people who were responsible for overseeing the fate of every single political prisoner in Iran. They started with the MEK, but once they finished off the MEK, they went to other prisoners as well. And one of the members of that death commission was actually Ibrahim Raisi. He was the youngest member of that death commission. He was only 28 years old at the time, but the most ruthless person within that death commission. In a matter of 2-3 months, they killed as many as 30,000 political prisoners. And by the way, none of these political prisoners were sentenced to death. And they were basically people who were arrested in street protests or different activities, distributing pamphlets or showing some level of opposition to the Iranian regime. Most of them had already been tried and sentenced to certain terms, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years imprisonment. Nevertheless, Khomeini's fatwa was explicit: just go take care of all the prisoners and ask them one thing: are they still loyal to this movement, to this organization or not? If they're still loyal, no matter what their background, no matter what they have done, they need to be executed. That's a very explicit order by Khomeini. And he repeatedly said that, you need to show no mercy whatsoever, eliminate them all. The whole purpose was to uproot the whole movement, and Raisi was a key member of that death commission.
And where were those executions done?
Well, those executions were done in Tehran, the capital, but also in other cities as well, all over the country. In Evin prison, Qazar Hisar prison, Gohardash, and so many other prisons where prisoners were there. And they would call every single prisoner before this death commission and interview them and ask them one question: what's your position about the MEK? If they said anything that showed loyalty to the movement, then that was the end of the interview. They would send them to another room, which they didn't know that later on that they would soon be executed. And in a matter of days, they would line them up and hang them in prison. They had a special place in the prison, or execute them by firing squads. And it was so egregious, even though all of it was totally secret. No one knew about any of these things. But within the inner circle of the regime, the number 2 person in the regime who was successor designate to then Supreme Leader Khomeini, his name was Ayatollah Montazeri. Montazeri found out about it and objected it, wrote letters to Khomeini protesting it. He actually summoned the 4 members of the death commission to his office and saying, why you're doing these things? These people have already been tried. We have no justification whatsoever to kill people whom we have already tried and they're serving their term. And he said that this is going to be the worst crime in the history of this regime. And one of the people who was, vehemently defending these killings was Raisi. You can hear it. That meeting some 30 years ago was taped on audio tape. And that audio tape became...
Is there a copy of that available?
Yes, that audio tape became public in 2016, right before the last presidential elections in Iran. You can hear the voices of Montazeri. You can hear the voices of the members of the Death Commission who are defending it. But Montazeri says that even young girls as old as 15 years old are being executed. Pregnant women are being executed.
So he was proud of it.
Raisi was clear. All of the members of the Death Commission were proud of it.
And they were speaking. Who were they speaking to?
They were speaking to the successor designated, the number 2 person in the regime who was critical of these killings, Montazeri. Yeah, he was a senior Ayatollah. He's dead now, but he was supposed to be the successor to Khomeini instead of Khamenei. But because he protested these members of the Death Commission, eventually Khomeini sacked him and removed him from his position, put him on a house arrest, and eventually Khamenei became the successor of the supreme leader.
It's time to take a brief intermission. I accomplished a lot in 2020, exposing the truth, establishing the relationship with you, working tirelessly for America. And I came to know the work and value of the people at American Hartford Gold. You see, you buy gold not only for what you know, but you buy gold for what you don't know. American Hartford Gold is the company you can trust when it comes to buying gold. They sell physical gold and silver delivered right to your door or inside of your IRA. In the precious metals industry, they are the highest rated firm in our country with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau and thousands of satisfied clients. Give them a call and tell them Rudy sent you. And be sure to ask them what I bought. And if you call them right now, they will give you up to $1,500 of free silver on your first order. Folks, these are uncertain times. The one thing you can count on to protect what you have worked so hard for is physical gold and silver. So don't wait. Call them now. Call 833-GOLD-777. That's 833-GOLD-777. Or text Rudy to 65532. Again, that's 833-GOLD-777. Or text Rudy to 65532. Thank you for returning. Recently, when Raisi was declared the victor, Amnesty International, which is not necessarily a right-wing organization of any kind, just the opposite, said about Raisi's election, they called for him to be investigated for crimes against humanity. They said Ibrahim Raisi has risen to the presidency instead of being investigated for the crimes against humanity of murder, enforced disappearance, and torture, is a grim reminder that impunity reigns supreme in Iran. So that's Amnesty International. And they are quite aware of the 1988 massacres. And it was a source of tremendous complaint by them at the time.
Yeah. Actually, Amnesty International did a thorough investigation about it since 2-3 years ago. They interviewed so many different victims or family members of the victims, anyone who could really be a witness about this, and compiled that report. And they concluded that what happened in 1988 elevates to the crime against humanity. It has to be, punishable. And they pinpointed the role of Ibrahim Raisi. That's why when Raisi became president, declared president by the regime, they put out this statement. It was also another statement by Human Rights Watch. Before that, there were 7 top United Nations experts who had done their own investigation, and they called for international investigation about the crimes against humanity in 1988, including the role of Ibrahim Raisi. U.S. Congress, Mayor, has also spoken about this. There was a resolution that was filed earlier this year in the first 100 days of this new administration in the 117th Congress It's HRES 118, and I have a copy of it here. HRES 118. This resolution talks about the killings and the human rights violations in Iran, as well as terrorism of the regime. And they talk about the need for international investigation about this and putting them on trial. But they also urge the United States, and I read, whereas the United States should be involved in any establishment of an international investigation into the 1988 extrajudicial killings of Iranian dissidents. So that's why I think every time that you hear the name of Raisi, this issue of the 1988 massacre comes up righteously.
So just to be perfectly precise, the Human Rights Watch wrote, as head of Iran's repressive judiciary, Raisi oversaw some of the most heinous crimes in Iran's recent history, which deserve investigation and accountability rather than election to high office. So I think it's without doubt that Iran elected a terrorist and a person accused of crimes against humanity. That's a rather extraordinary election to have that person elected. So tell us, who is Ibrahim? Who is this Ibrahim Raisi? He comes from the same place that you come from, doesn't he?
Well, you know, Ibrahim Raisi actually is, in one word, he's a murderer, he's a criminal, he's a mass murderer, and, you know, he needs to be tried for crimes against humanity. Let me just say a few words about his background,
sure.
Mayor.
And is he from the same area of Iran that you are?
Yes, he comes from Mashhad. Actually, yes, he was born in the same city that I was born, unfortunately.
And a lot of his connections come out of there, right? Because
exactly.
he had a connection through marriage to one of the Ayatollahs, and then he has a connection to the present. He was sort of a favorite of both Ayatollahs.
Yes. You know, Ibrahim Raisi is perhaps the closest person to the Supreme Leader Khamenei, and he's so devoted to this regime that, you know, he practically has no education. He just went to, you know, secondary school, and at the age of 15, he went to Qom, where the religious seminaries are. And then at the age of 19, when the revolution took place in Iran, he became, so he joined the judiciary of the regime, which was involved in the killings at the time. And he became the head of the revolutionary court in the city of Karaj, near Tehran. And Karaj is no small town. It's the fourth most populated city in Iran. And then, and he rose in that level so rapidly, you know, a big head of the prosecution at the age of 20 with no background, no education. You must be an absolute murderer to hold that position. And then when he was only 28 years old, he was a member of that death commission, so confident, a close confidant of Khomeini. And then in 2016, he was appointed as the head of a very huge foundation called Astana Quds Razavi, which is based in Mashhad in Khorasan province, where I come from. And it has tremendous amount of resources, hundreds of billions of dollars of resources are endowed and under his control. God knows how much money he moved around and funded. He actually confessed that during the last presidential election that he sent a lot of money to the terrorist groups in Lebanon and in Syria, using the funds and the resources there.
Well,
and then in 2019,
I can't help but interrupt here and say, you're now describing something we say so quickly and don't think about, that Iran, the regime of terror, is the biggest source of funding to terrorism in the world. What that means is if you give money to Iran, necessarily some of that money is going to go to a terrorist group, like recently Hamas, right? And they're going to use it to kill people, right?
Absolutely. You know, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, these are known facts. Everyone knows, and the regime itself concedes that they are fully behind them. Ironically, Mayor, just a week before the screening process of this presidential election, that was last month, Supreme Leader Khamenei on his own website published letters of congratulations from the leaders of Islamic Jihad and Hamas, who praised the Iranian regime for providing the missiles during the conflict in Gaza just last month. And that shows that the supreme leader is involved in that, boasts about it, relies on these groups to stay in power, and also relies on the Revolutionary Guards and repressive forces to stay power inside the country. And the reason, Mayor, that Raisi was handpicked by the supreme leader Khamenei to really become the next president, he actually practically cleared the way for him with no serious contenders, was that Khamenei needs Raisi at this juncture. He doesn't need anyone like has a face of moderation or anything like that as they did before. The game is over. He, gloves off, and he's just like basically going head on.
Why is that? So that's very interesting observation. So several years ago, when they selected Rouhani was sold as a moderate, and probably oversold as a moderate, because Rouhani is only moderate in a kingdom of murderers. Right? Let's say he didn't do as much murder as all of them, but he did his share of murder also, which of course we always pointed out. But it is true, he spoke a more moderate game. He always spoke moderately, even though he didn't act that way. And he wouldn't be considered in the worst category of these killers like Raisi. So Khamenei decided he needed somebody tougher than Rouhani. Now, here he is going into a possible new agreement with the U.S., where he can get a lot of that money like he got last time, which he could use for killing people. Why would he put a, this is an obviously terrible choice. He could have even picked a killer and a murderer that we didn't know as much about. He picks a person with international reputation as a war criminal. This is like Hitler picking Goebbels after we knew all about Goebbels. Right? We will now take a brief intermission. Your credit card company found suspicious charges on your card. That's simple identity theft. It's annoying, but they cover it. The type of fraud you really need to worry about is home title theft, a devastating crime that takes you off your home's title. And you're not covered by insurance or most identity theft programs. That's why you need Home Title Lock. Here's how easy it is for cyber criminals to get you. The title documents to our homes are kept online. The thief forges your signature on a quitclaim deed stating you just sold your home, and he's the new owner. Then he borrows money using your home's equity and leaves you in debt. You won't know until late payment or eviction notices arrive. The instant Home Title Lock detects someone tampering with your home's title, they help shut it down. Let's get you protected. Go to HometitleLock.com and register your address to see if you're already a victim. And enter Rudy for 30 free days of protection. That's promo code Rudy at HometitleLock.com. There are very few people who know this much about what's really going on in Iran, so let's continue with Alireza.
Well, that's an excellent question, Mayor. And it's very important to think about that question because, logically, he would need, especially when the time that the negotiations started and all of that, he would need another so-called moderate face to be able to beguile the rest of the world, another Rouhani, somebody like that. But
that worked a little bit. Maybe not with us, but it worked on some of the weak-minded Americans and all of the weak-minded Europeans.
Well, it worked in Europe. It worked here. It works everywhere. I mean, when you have that kind of a face, and you pose yourself as a moderate, that's how it works. But in reality, what happened, Mayor, is that the reason that Khamenei decided that he wants someone as ruthless as Raisi at the helm is because of two key elements. Number one, this election is taking place in the backdrop of the protests in Iran that started in 2017. 2017, 2018, 2019, they were large-scale
wasn't that January 2017?
In December 2017, January 2018, November 2019, and it was so widespread in over 200 cities all across Iran.
I remember your showing me, and then going to Paris and going to Albania and seeing many photographs of. I mean, these protests are a reality. Now, the reason I make a point of that is the censorship that goes on in the Western media is disgraceful, because many Americans have no idea that since 2017, almost until now, with a few interruptions, there have been continuous protests in how many Iranian cities? 150, 160?
Well, in over 200 cities,
over 200? Mayor. All over.
All over the country. I mean, because, before, if it were in Tehran or just intellectuals, university students, you would understand it. But when you have protests starting in the smaller towns all over the country, and basically the poor, the deprived, those who used to be the power base of the Ayatollahs were the ones who started the protest and calling for the fall of the Ayatollahs, saying death to Khamenei, death to dictatorship. And they were saying the enemy is right here. They lie when they say it's America. Clearly, Khamenei got the message that the tide has turned. The entire population, the vast majority of them, have now turned against the regime. And then when the election time came, he knew that this election will be boycotted. So he figured, forget about the voter participation, which he always boasted that, oh, we have a very large voter participation in our elections. This time, he knew that that's not going to happen. And in fact, what happened on the election day just last week, the polling stations were totally deserted. The foreign journalists who were taken to Iran, and perhaps they were handpicked to make sure that there were some favorable reportings, none of that happened. All of these journalists who went there, they said the polling stations were deserted. And because we had called for the boycott of the elections, Mrs. Rajavi, Mariam Rajavi, the president-elect of the Parliament in Exile, the National Council of Resistance, had called back in March for the all-out boycott of this election, saying this is a sham election, no one should participate, and it paid off. And actually, look at the official figures, which is very telling. The official figures are always 5 times higher than the actual ones, but even that's interesting, because this time they said in overall voter participation was 48.8. And then about over 7% of them were actually the votes that were nullified because they were either blank or people write curse on those votes. You actually write the name of the candidate, and in some name of candidate, they were just cursing at the Ayatollahs. That's a very large percentage. So if you take that out, that's only 42 official voter participation by the people. So that means 58% of the people, according to the regime, boycotted the elections. Look at Tehran, the city of Tehran, which is most important. The regime announced that the voter participation was only 26%, in compared to over 70% last time. And if you take out the nullified votes, that's about 20%. So 80% of the population in Tehran boycotted the elections. Our own estimate, based on the reports that we compiled from 1,200 observers we had in 429 cities all over the country, taking pictures, films, and looking at everything, we concluded that less than 10% of the population participated in this election. And keep in mind, this is not a choice for you to go and vote. When you go to vote, they stamp your ID, and that stamp is needed. If you want to get a job, if you want to go to school, for anything, you need that stamp in your ID.
What happens to the people that didn't vote? I mean, at least 52%, maybe as many as 90% didn't vote. They don't have the stamp. What happens to them?
Exactly. Well, that shows that people are just risking. They know some bad things could happen to them, but they're just they're totally fed up. I think this boycott of the election this time is the flip side of the protests that we saw since 2017, that the people have totally rejected this regime in its entirety. They don't buy this moderate versus radical game at all. That's why Khamenei decided, okay, I have this population I need to deal with. I need somebody who is an absolute murderer, who would leave no mercy to the population. That's Ibrahim Raisi. I want him as president at the helm, and that's what happened.
Well, if we go back to when Rouhani was in office, And then Trump completely abrogated the agreement, got out of the agreement. I do remember a very important moment, and I wonder if this was critical. Some time ago, there was a similar movement that started in Tehran, and Barack Obama and Joe Biden turned their backs on it and said, basically would say nothing about it. It looked like an uprising was beginning. When this uprising began, President Trump said that these people are fighting for their freedom. Very similar to what President Reagan said about Poland. And also coupled it with dropping out of the agreement. How much did that give impetus to what was going on?
Well, Mayor, you know, the people of Iran are very aware of what's really happening around them, despite all the censorship, despite the fact that, you know, you have a state-controlled media. But people have ways to find out where different countries, where different politicians, where different parliaments in various parts of the world stand. And that's why it was very encouraging to them to know that when they stood up, for instance, in 2017, 2018, 2019, the world really backed them. There were all kinds of condemnations coming from different parts of the world, including the statements of support from the US administration here. What the regime tried to do, they wanted to say that always they've done that the enemy is actually the United States. All the problems are foreign. It's because of the sanctions. It's because of this country or that country. It's because of these countries in the region or those countries in Europe or the United States. But the people of Iran don't buy that, and they didn't buy it. There was not even a single incident in all of these protests since 2017 that people ever chanted against the United States or put the blame on the outside world. Instead, they repeatedly held the regime and the ruthless rulers responsible for the misery, for the economic misery. They talk about corruption in Iran. You know, the majority of the wealth of a nation is controlled by the Revolutionary Guards and those spooky foundations controlled by the supreme leader. Iran is a rich country, Mayor. Everyone knows Iran has the second largest gas and oil reserves combined in the world. Yet 80% of the Iranian population live below the poverty line. Why is that so? It's because the money is there. There is money in Iran. Where is the money? It's in the hands of the Revolutionary Guards and a very small group of people who control everything. That's why the people anger has always been against the rulers in Iran, and they would appreciate if the outside world would actually support them, would actually stand on their side, would recognize their right to determine their own future. When this House resolution that I referred to earlier this year got the majority of the support in the House, 243 members, both Democrats and Republicans, co-sponsored this resolution, which basically says that the Iranian people have the right to determine their own future.
My goodness, of course they do.
Right. Yes, exactly. And they say, you know, that we stand on the side of the people of Iran. I think the best thing any country can do, including the United States, is to recognize, especially now, that when it comes to Iran, the Iranian regime represents only a very small group of the elite who are controlling everything in Iran. The vast majority of the Iranian population have rejected this regime. So the true partner of the United States is not, you know, Raisi or Khamenei or anybody else who is ruling the country. The true partners of the United States and Europe are actually the people of Iran, who want a free Iran, who want a democratic Iran, who want separation of church and state, who want, you know, election as to be the only criteria for legitimacy. They want peace in the Middle East, and they want non-nuclear Republic Iran.
We will be back shortly. I've been sleeping on my pillows for some time. I love them. They're simply the very best pillows ever made. But I just found out that they also have a wide assortment of other incredible products like their mattress toppers, sheets, towels, and slippers, and more. Listeners have helped build MyPillow into the incredible company it is today, and Mike Lindell wants to give back to all of you. Pick some pillows or pick several of the other great products, and you can get super discounts on MyPillow products by going to mypillow.com, promo code Rudy, or call 1-800-725-7759, promo code Rudy right now and see each of the specially priced items, including those in the radio listener special square. You're going to see rotational offers up to 66% off on products like the pillows, mattress topper, and geyser sheets, but also new products like their slippers, weighted blankets, robes, and waffle blankets. All My Pillow products come with a 60-day money-back guarantee. Enter promo code Rudy for these new great specials. That's mypillow.com, promo code Rudy. Let's go back to our interview with Alireza. Isn't this selection of Raisi logically, and my goodness, logic doesn't apply to foreign policy, unfortunately, but logically, wouldn't this end any discussion of a new nuclear agreement, which would, among other things, give a lot of money to the Ayatollah, much of which would be used to kill innocent people? Because they have never, even the first time, they would not make a commitment as to how they would use that money. And John Kerry was afraid to ask for such a commitment. He's also been advising them secretly for 4 years on how to avoid Donald Trump. So I was very disappointed to see that the reaction of the Biden administration on Raisi was to say they're still going ahead, no matter what, with these the possibility of a new agreement where we begin funding terrorism through Iran, which is what it is. That's what it should be called. Do you think there's a chance that will be changed, given the fact that, as you realize, the crimes committed by this man, it's impossible to do business with a regime like that?
Well, Mayor, I hope people understand, not just here in Washington, but also in Europe and other places, that everything has now changed in compared to 2015. It's good to just say we want to go back to the 2015 nuclear deal, even if people think that that was the greatest deal in the world. But they also need to understand that everything has changed on the ground in Iran. This regime is in big trouble. It's fighting for its own survival. In the region, things have changed because the balance of power in the region has changed. Before, a lot of these Arab and Muslim nations who were perhaps in cahoots with the Ayatollahs, or maybe too afraid to speak up against the regime, have now risen up and are speaking up against the regime, have formed new coalitions in the region that has put the regime in a weaker position. And also here in the United States, I think members of Congress have a lot more information now than they had in 2015. That's why, for instance, Senator Bob Menendez, who's the chair of the Foreign Relations
and a Democrat, right?
And a Democrat, a chair of Foreign Relations Committee, his position is that, first of all, he says, why in the world the Iranian regime should have any enrichment capability at all? Because if you have the ability to enrich uranium, you have, obtained a very important part of building a nuclear bomb. Before the 2015 nuclear deal, it was agreed upon generally that no country in the region should have any enrichment right, enrichment capability. And under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, they shouldn't. And it was only in 2015 that some level of legitimacy was given to that nuclear enrichment, and we now saw the outcome.
How close do you think they are to having full nuclear capacity? Because we do know they were cheating all through this period. It's been discovered numerous times. It'd be hard to mention all the reports that found them cheating. They get buried because the New York Times doesn't try to cover them, but everybody sees them. So how close are they right now so that they'll be ready? Because the agreement, people should know that the agreement allows them to become a nuclear power, including nuclear warheads, but there's a 10-year gap. Now that 10-year gap is a 5-year gap, if you go back to the old agreement. And they've been enriching since then. So they must be pretty close to having that capacity.
Mayor, if you want to build a weapon, you need 3 things. You need the fissile material. You need to be able to weaponize it and make the actual weapon, and you also need to deliver it. So you need the missile program, you need the weaponization part of it, and you have to have enough fissile material enrichment. The nuclear deal basically only dealt with the enrichment part of things, supposedly to some limit, but left open the nuclear weaponization part of things. And a lot of those questions related to what they call possible military dimension, which is the weaponization work, that was clearly what the regime was doing, was left out. And that's why all these elements, we have to look at it. Now, how far advanced they are on the weaponization, no one knows. I don't think they're as far advanced as the regime tries to claim, because what the regime is now trying to do, they want to force the Biden administration to rush and give them everything by enriching uranium way beyond the limit to 63%, by increasing the amount of enriched uranium, by defying basically the JCPOA, and then putting the blame on the United States, saying, you were the ones who left the JCPOA, you are the one to be blamed for this. The reality of the fact is that, first of all, it was the Iranian regime that was in violation of the JCPOA back in 2015. Look at the recent reports by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, that shows that there were at least 3 nuclear sites where nuclear material were introduced that was hidden. It was never revealed.
Who discovered
the outside world. The IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, in the most recent report is there. Finally, they were able to go and examine, look at those sites and took samples, and they found enriched uranium there. So that by itself shows that the regime was in violation in 2015 because they lied. They should have declared all of these sites. The nuclear archive that shows like the whole nuclear program was never conceded. That should have been announced by the regime in 2015. So we shouldn't be intimidated by the regime's actions and just rush and give everything to the Ayatollahs. I think what Senator Menendez, for instance, is doing is that he's saying, wait a minute, don't rush anything, don't lift any sanctions prematurely, don't give the Ayatollahs anything. Just look at this whole thing in a big picture. You also need to not only address the nuclear weapons program of the regime, you need to address the missile program, you need to address the destabilizing activities in the region, the way they're funding terror in the whole Middle East. Because if you leave those aspects of the regime untouched, then the regime would use all of that against you.
Well, and the agreement does not touch on any of that.
The agreement, the 2015 agreement, doesn't touch any of those things, including the missile part of the program, including terrorism, and of course, including human rights. None of that is addressed that. So that's why Senator Menendez keeps saying that we need to have a comprehensive agreement that covers all of those things, but also more importantly, no enrichment capability. He introduced actually a language with Senator Lindsey Graham in a bipartisan way, saying no enrichment should be allowed to the Iran regime. There should be an enrichment bank that if Iran or other countries want it for their energy purposes, they can get it from there. Why do they want to enrich uranium?
Well, the reality is if there is an agreement, Iran will be expecting a great deal more money again. And last time we gave a lot of that money in cash. Now, it strikes me that the only reason you'd give that money in cash is because that money was going to terrorists. Governments transact business by wire. You don't deliver $1 million in aid to Colombia in cash. You do it by wire, unless you're dealing with the cartels. So wouldn't an agreement give life to the regime of terror in a period of time in which it seems to be dying? They still have protests all over Iran. They've just elected a world-famous murderer as president. They have blood on their hands for the rockets sent into Israel, which demonstrates they support terrorists. Wouldn't it be completely absurd at this point to give them a lifeline and let them have an agreement they've already violated, but also enormous amounts of cash, which we know they're going to give to terrorists? So shouldn't this kill the agreement as anything that any responsible nation would do, unless they were somehow mesmerized by the desire to be popular with the Ayatollah?
Well, Mayor, not even now, at any time, any amount of cash, even $1, should never be given to the Iranian regime, because none of that would be spent
Biden and
on the
Obama
people of Iran.
They gave him billions.
Over close to $2 billion cash and over $100 billion of other resources that has ended up.
And a lot of cash, a lot of cash.
Yeah,
you use cash for organized criminals and terrorists. Are they that stupid that they didn't realize the cash? Why would the Ayatollah be asking for cash? He's got a bank account. He's got a lot of offshore bank accounts. He doesn't need cash. If he's going to take it, he'll take it right out of the treasury. He has no problem doing it. The guy's probably the richest guy in Iran, isn't he?
Well, he certainly is. He's probably the richest man in the world, Mayor.
And all those mullahs who we think are monks, and they're a bunch of mafia gangsters who are millionaires, right?
Absolutely. You know, one of the Hamas leaders recently had an interview, and he said, a few years ago, when they went to Iran and he met with Qasem Soleimani, and he said that Hamas needs some money, and Qasem Soleimani gave him $20 million cash in bags, in suitcases, to take it on the plane. He said, there were only a few of us. We couldn't take all of the cash because, we couldn't carry all the suitcases. That's where the money
Soleimani
goes.
was the major Iranian assassin, killer, killed a lot of American soldiers. He's the one that Trump was able to successfully eliminate, who Biden thought it was a mistake for him to do it. So I don't know. The issues you raise, Alireza, are very, very important ones. They're even more important because many of them are not covered effectively in the United States. And I also want to remind people that we have a podcast of several months ago in which you gave us a number of the video of the protests that are going on inside Iran. We don't see those in the United States. We don't see on our nightly news the protests of the teachers and the protests of the bus drivers and the protests of the construction workers. I mean, this isn't just political people protesting now. These are the people who are fed up with the oppression, and they're fed up with the starvation. It's a rich country, and the money's being taken by the bosses on top, and it's going to Hezbollah, Hamas, and terrorist groups we never even heard of. So we need you back. So stay tuned. We got to find out how this goes, whether Raisi makes it, because there'll be a lot of objection to him, and then whether we have the courage to just cut off this agreement with a murderer sitting there. But thank you very, very much, Alireza. You've been a good friend to the United States for a long time, but you're also a great patriot for your own country. And when Iran becomes a free country, one of the people that's going to be a hero is my friend Alireza. I didn't get into the death threats against you and their attempt to kill you, and you're a real hero, my friend. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Mayor. I really appreciate your kind words. I think the real heroes are those who have already sacrificed their lives in Iran, and those who are in the forefront, who are fighting, and all of those who stand up and be their voice. I'm just very small voice, and very happy to be and proud to be a part of this, a very small part of this, but really appreciate that. I think these are very important times. I think this is the time that we can do the right thing and make sure that their international investigation led by the United States is taking place about Ibrahim Raisi. That's the most important task, I think, and be more important than any deal on any issues. We need to deal with the murderer who is now at the helm, and also understand that Iran today is very different than 2015. There is an explosive society that has a very strong drive and desire for free Iran. That's going to happen. All we need to do is just to stand up on their side and understand the realities and embrace it.
Well, we'd like to have you back before the meeting and then have some coverage of that meeting. Very, very soon, you're going to have your annual meeting. And this is it's always at an opportune, I can say it's a real opportune time. A lot of things, every time we have it, something is going on. even sometimes they're trying to kill us, right? So it would be silly for me to say it's happening at an opportune time. Every single one has been an opportune time. But tell us when that meeting is going to be.
Well, you know, the annual meeting that the resistance has every year, of course, it used to be in person. Now it's all virtual. It's actually in the second week of July. You know, and it's very important because it's going to be like a united voice. Democrats, Republicans, you know, Europeans, Americans, people in the Middle East, all of them are going to speak in one voice in support of freedom in Iran, in support of democracy in Iran. And hopefully this will be the very last event that we will have virtual. And the next one would be in person and in Tehran.
They were always inspirational when they were in person. And we've had them in Paris and we've had them in Astana. And we always pray that the next year we're going to have them in Tehran. And I think maybe we're getting there. We're getting there, and mostly due to someone else we have to talk about in the next couple of weeks when you come back, and that's the great leader, Madame Rajavi, and her great people. I don't think people know that she has a government in waiting with extraordinarily competent people ready to take over if the right thing can happen the way it has elsewhere. But that's for another time. Thank you very much for enlightening us on the new president of the regime of terror.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you, Alireza. See you soon. And stay safe, my friend.